For over a century, a land at the crossroads of history, religion, and politics has been the epicenter of one of the world's most enduring and controversial conflicts, the Israel-Palestinian conflict. But what is the real story behind it? From ancient claims to the land, to wars, peace talks, and the deep wounds that still shape the lives of millions, this conflict is much more than the headlines you see today. It's about identity, justice, and a quest for peace that seems elusive. Why has this land become a symbol of so much pain, and yet so much hope? How did we get here, and is there a path to reconciliation? In this video, we strip away the myths, the politics, and the propaganda to uncover the truth behind one of the most complex, heartbreaking, and significant conflicts of our time. We'll dive deep into the roots of the conflict, explore the pivotal moments that changed the course of history, and uncover the untold stories that have shaped this land and its people. Stay with us as we break down the facts, challenge the narratives, and get to the heart of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. This is the truth behind the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Chapter 1. The roots of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. The Israel-Palestinian conflict is one of the most divisive and complex struggles in modern history. But to truly understand it, we need to go back, long before Israel was a state, long before Zionism and Palestinian nationalism, to the deep historical roots that shaped this land. The land we now call Israel and Palestine has been home to various civilizations for thousands of years. In ancient times, it was inhabited by Canaanites, Philistines, and Hebrews. Jewish history in the region dates back to biblical times. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah flourished here until they were conquered, first by the Babylonians, then the Romans. The Romans destroyed the Second Jewish Temple in 70 CE, leading to the Jewish diaspora, where Jews were scattered across the world. Centuries later, in the 7th century, Arab-Muslim forces conquered the region, bringing Islam and establishing what would become a predominantly Arab and Muslim land. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, built in Jerusalem, became sacred sites for Muslims. For centuries, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities lived together under Islamic empires, including the Ottomans, who ruled the land from 1517 to 1917. But in the 19th century, things began to change. By the 1800s, Jews in Europe faced persecution, pogroms, and discrimination. In response, a political movement called Zionism emerged, seeking to establish a Jewish homeland. Many believed it should be in their ancestral land, Palestine. Led by Theodor Herzl, Zionists encouraged Jewish migration to Palestine, which was still under Ottoman rule. But there was one major issue. Palestine was already home to an Arab population that had lived there for generations. At the same time, Arab nationalism was rising. Arabs across the Middle East, including Palestinian Arabs, sought independence from colonial rule and feared that Jewish immigration would threaten their land and way of life. Then came World War I, and everything changed. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, promising support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, while also making promises to Arab leaders about independence. These conflicting commitments set the stage for decades of conflict. After the war, Britain took control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. Jewish immigration increased, funded by Zionist organizations, while Palestinian Arabs resisted what they saw as a foreign takeover of their homeland. By the 1930s, violence broke out between Jewish and Arab communities. The British struggled to maintain control, and tensions escalated with the rise of both Jewish militias and Palestinian resistance movements. Then came World War II and the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were murdered. Global sympathy for Jewish refugees intensified, leading to more Jewish migration to Palestine. But Palestinian Arabs continued to resist, leading to riots, attacks, and growing unrest. Chapter 2. The rise of Zionism and Arab nationalism. The Middle East was once a land of empires, traditions, and coexistence. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, two powerful movements emerged, Zionism and Arab nationalism, forever changing the fate of the region. Zionism was born out of centuries of Jewish persecution in Europe. In the 19th century, Jews faced pogroms in Eastern Europe and deep-rooted anti-Semitism in the West. Many saw only one solution, a homeland where they could be safe. Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist, believed Jews would never be accepted in Europe. In 1896, he published Der Judenstaat, arguing that Jews needed their own state. A year later, in 1897, Herzl organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, where a resolution was passed. The goal of Zionism is to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured by public law. At that time, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, home to a diverse population of Arabs, Jews, and Christians. But Zionists saw it as their historic homeland, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. With funding from European Jewish philanthropists, Jewish migration to Palestine increased. Settlers established agricultural communities like Petah Tikva and Tel Aviv, show images of early kibbutzim, orange groves, and Jewish laborers. Meanwhile, a different movement was taking shape: Arab nationalism. For centuries, Arabs lived under Ottoman rule, but by the late 19th century, a sense of Arab identity and unity was growing. Arab nationalists sought independence from the Ottomans. They envisioned a future where Arabs controlled their own lands, free from foreign rule. During World War I, Britain and France secretly divided the Middle East through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, betraying promises made to Arab leaders like Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who had led the Arab revolt against the Ottomans. After the war, instead of granting Arabs full independence, Britain and France took control of much of the region under the League of Nations mandate system. This betrayal fueled Arab nationalism, leading to resentment not only against Western powers, but also against the growing Zionist movement in Palestine. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, promising to support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. For Zionists, this was a historic victory. For Arabs, it was a betrayal. By the 1920s and 1930s, tensions escalated. Jewish immigration increased, land purchases displaced Palestinian farmers, and violence erupted. Arab nationalist leaders called for independence and the end of Jewish immigration, while Zionist leaders continued pushing for a Jewish homeland. The stage was set for one of the most complex conflicts in modern history, a struggle between two national movements claiming the same land. The rise of Zionism and Arab nationalism shaped the destiny of the Middle East, leading to peace efforts and ongoing struggles that continue to this day. But could things have turned out differently? Chapter 3. The creation of Israel and the First Arab-Israeli War, May 14, 1948, a day that changed the Middle East forever. The State of Israel was declared, sparking celebrations among Jews and outrage among Arabs. Within hours, the region erupted into war. But how did this moment come to be? What led to the First Arab-Israeli War? To understand the conflict, we need to go back to the years leading up to Israel's creation and the violent struggle that followed. By the early 20th century, Jewish migration to Palestine was increasing, fueled by Zionism, the movement for a Jewish homeland, and the horrors of World War II. The Holocaust had left 6 million Jews dead, strengthening the demand for a safe refuge. But Jewish aspirations in Palestine had been building for decades. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, without consulting the Arab majority already living there. As Jewish immigration grew, so did tensions. Arabs saw their homeland slipping away, leading to violent uprisings. By 1947, Britain, exhausted and unable to manage the crisis, turned to the United Nations for a solution. The UN proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international control. Jews accepted the plan, but Arabs rejected it, calling it unfair and illegitimate. On November 29, 1947, the UN voted to approve the partition. Violence erupted almost immediately. As Jewish and Arab militias clashed, Palestine spiraled into chaos. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, leader of the Jewish community in Palestine, announced the creation of the State of Israel. Jews celebrated in the streets, knowing they finally had a homeland. But for Arabs, this was a catastrophe, what they call the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Overnight, the map of the Middle East had changed. The very next day, 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon and Iraq, invaded, launching the first Arab-Israeli war. The war was brutal. The Arab armies aimed to destroy Israel before it could take root, but they underestimated the determination of the Jewish fighters. Jewish forces, led by the Haganah and other militias, were outnumbered but well organized. As battles raged across the land, thousands of Palestinian civilians fled or were expelled from their homes, an event that remains one of the most painful aspects of the conflict. By early 1949, Israel had gained the upper hand. The Arab armies, plagued by poor coordination and limited resources, began retreating. One by one, Arab nations signed ceasefires. By the end of the war, Israel controlled more land than the original UN plan had granted. The West Bank was taken by Jordan, and Gaza fell under Egyptian control. Palestine, as it had existed before, was effectively gone. For Palestinians, the war created a refugee crisis that continues to shape the conflict today. For Israel, it was a victory, but one that ensured decades of future wars and unrest. The First Arab-Israeli War laid the foundation for everything that followed: territorial disputes, further wars, and failed peace efforts. But it all started with one declaration in 1948. The story of Israel's creation and the First Arab-Israeli War is not just history, it's the key to understanding the present. The conflict rages on, but to find a solution, we must first understand how it all began. Chapter 4: Wars, Occupation, and Failed Peace Efforts. For decades, the Israel-Palestinian conflict has been defined by wars, occupations, and broken peace deals. Every attempt at peace has been met with setbacks. But why? What has kept this conflict burning for generations? From full-scale wars to uprisings, from peace agreements to political assassinations, the road to peace has been paved with blood and broken promises. The First Arab-Israeli War erupted in 1948 after Israel declared independence. Arab nations invaded, but Israel emerged victorious, expanding its territory. For Israelis, this was a triumph. For Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, never allowed to return home. This war laid the foundation for the unresolved crisis we see today. 1967, the Six-Day War, a game changer. In 1967, tensions erupted again. In just 6 days, Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, capturing the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Showing Israeli soldiers at the Western Wall, then Palestinian protests. For Israel, it was a miraculous victory. For Palestinians, it meant occupation, military rule, restrictions, and growing resistance. 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the last major Arab-Israeli war. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during Yom Kippur. Israel pushed back but suffered heavy losses. The war led to peace between Israel and Egypt, but no solution for Palestinians. After 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, sparking decades of unrest. Settlements expanded, military crackdowns intensified, and Palestinian frustration boiled over. In 1987, the First Intifada, an uprising against Israeli rule, shook the region. Palestinian protests, boycotts, and violent clashes became daily occurrences. The world took notice, and for the first time, serious peace efforts began. Bill Clinton. In 1993, Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, signed the Oslo Accords. The deal aimed to create a Palestinian state and end Israeli occupation. But extremists on both sides rejected the agreement. In 1995, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist. The peace process stalled. In 2000, tensions exploded again. Palestinian protests turned into armed resistance. Suicide bombings, Israeli airstrikes, and military crackdowns led to thousands of deaths. The Second Intifada ended in 2005, but the damage was irreversible. Peace seemed impossible. In 2006, Hamas won Palestinian elections, leading to a split. Fatah controlled the West Bank, Hamas ruled Gaza. Multiple wars followed between Israel and Hamas, with thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire. Gaza remains under blockade, while Israeli settlements continue to expand in the West Bank. The cycle of violence never ends. Conclusion. Why has peace failed? Show protests, peace talks, and international leaders. Peace has failed because of deep distrust, political divisions, and extremists on both sides. International efforts have stalled. Every war creates new wounds, making peace harder to achieve. The question remains, will there ever be a real solution? Or is this conflict doomed to continue? Understanding history is the first step toward change. If you want more deep, well-researched content like this, subscribe to Mr. Gar Scholar and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Let's uncover the truth together.